What's going on, everyone? Ligature64 here. So, 2017 has been a fantastic year for video games, with games like Persona 5, Call of Duty World War II, Assassin's Creed Origins, and so many other phenomenal games coming out. And the Game Awards are coming up. They're fast approaching. So, the question that's on everyone's mind is, what is the game of the year for this year? And the really cool thing about it this year is that while there were so many phenomenal games, Nier Automata, Persona 5, all those I mentioned, the two that really come out on top are both Nintendo games this year, Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild. Not to downsize the other games that came out this year in any way whatsoever, but I find it incredible how both of those two games were the only ones that received almost nearly unanimous perfect 10 out of 10s for the entire year. So the question of this week is Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey? Which will come out on top? Because there are certain pros and cons to each game, obviously, despite them being near perfect. Even though that's a weird thing to hear myself say about any game, despite the fact that they are near perfect, they each have their own cons. For example, Breath of the Wild's Korok seeds. Fun. They make for a good upgrade system, I suppose. But after a while, they get a little bit tedious. Whereas Super Mario Odyssey's moons are quite a bit more fun to get. Each moon that you get is a lot more varied and interesting, as opposed to Breath of the Wild's Korok seeds, which are just, once you've seen 4 or 5 different types, there's only about 4 or 5 different types of puzzles for the Korok seeds. So Breath of the Wild has that against it. But on the flip side of the coin, Mario Odyssey's implementation of motion controls is slightly debatable. Breath of the Wild has some motion controls that aren't so good in it as well, but for the most part, Breath of the Wild uses the motion controls on the Switch, gyroscopic controls, whether you may be playing with the Joy-Con or the Pro Controller, for aiming with the bow and arrow. And this works fantastically. It really does. It works fantastically. However, Mario Odyssey's motion controls, they've been a bit of a point of contention. I'm not a huge fan of them. I wish that they had mapped them to a button and not made a few of the motion controls specific to motion. That's a personal gripe, though, and despite it being a personal gripe, I do feel like it's been a point of contention in terms of Mario Odyssey. So Mario Odyssey wins out in motion controls. Sorry, Breath of the Wild wins out in motion controls, but Mario Odyssey wins out in collection. In terms of the pros of each game, though, Breath of the Wild is a longer experience that may or may not add to it. A game doesn't necessarily have to be long in order to be good, but it certainly does work in its favor. However, because of that, Mario Odyssey is a lot more concentrated. Since Mario Odyssey is a lot shorter, there is a lot more amount of stuff to do within that shorter amount of time. Even though, arguably, Breath of the Wild still has a massive amount of things to do in the 120 hours that you could play that game. Let's see here. Mario Odyssey, while it may be more concentrated, isn't exactly a deep system. Breath of the Wild, for example, you got so many pieces of armor that you can get. You can cook food. You can do so many things in that game, and not to the level of a JRPG, but still there is a very deep system there. Whereas Mario Odyssey, you're basically running and jumping. Again, not to put either game down, they're different experiences, but they both have their own areas where they're slightly better than the other game. Then they have their own merits to them. So what do you guys think? Do you think that Mario Odyssey is going to win at Game of the Awards, or do you think that Breath of the Wild is? As for myself, it's honestly an incredibly, incredibly hard decision. But, you know something? I think that Breath of the Wild wins out in the end. Both incredible games, but Breath did just so much to add to the entire Zelda series as a whole. Mario Odyssey, it's still Mario, but Breath of the Wild is like a reinvention of the Zelda formula. So I feel like that's going to be what puts it over the edge and makes it Game of the Year for this year. Well, again, tell me, what do you guys think? Do you think that Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild are going to be Game of the Year? Let me know. Do you think that any of the other games will pass either of them up and cause an upset, take us all by surprise? Let me know if you think that's the case too. And hey, if you're new to the channel, I'm Linkage64. I talk about everything Nintendo, Nintendo Switch, Game of the Year, all that awesome stuff. And if you're interested, make sure you subscribe. And go check out my Instagram, Linkachu_64, where you can catch all sorts of content over there as well. Anyways, guys, what are you still doing here?